been romping through the woods with Bobby Joe. And if you ever romp through the woods with Bobby Joe, you're either swatting mosquitoes or pulling ticks off of them. So I'm glad he's here. I heard him several years ago at the Corinth camp. That's really how I first got started on Hearst. And I talked to him tonight. I want to tell y'all about the executing supposedly a Confederate prisoner one every mile. That's what got my interest. And so I've been on him for about a couple of years, finally got it down here. He's written a couple of books. He's now a publisher. If anybody wants to publish anything, he can help you out. He's from Dixon, Tennessee, which is just this side of Nashville. So he had a good bit of trouble to get here with us tonight. And he's going to tell us all about Hearst, Worst, and the deprivations not only to the soldiers, but to the local civilians during the war and after the war. So I want to present Kevin McCann.
Mark, thank you very much for inviting me to be here tonight. Thank you to Bobby for guiding me here tonight. I wish we'd had a little more time to romp through the woods tonight, but I appreciate the invitation to be here tonight, to come down here to Ripley, Mississippi. I have a few little good memories of Ripley. My grandparents were from Milan, Tennessee, and I can remember coming down here several weekends to come to your big flea market. And I had a lot of good memories.
Hey, there's
Can everybody hear me?
mic right there.
No.
There's a mic right there beside you on the table. Yes, sir. It's on, I think.
Can everybody hear me? It was the pursuit of my family's history that led me to write my book, Hearst's Worst, Colonel Field and Hearst in the 6th Tennessee Cavalry. I was told that my great-great-grandfather, 18-year-old John Wesley Plum, a farmer from McNairy County, had fought in the 6th Tennessee Cavalry. Naturally, I assumed it was a Confederate regiment. It wasn't until I discovered his military service records and his pension application that I learned that he had enlisted in Company G of a federal regiment of Southern soldiers that served under the command of Colonel Field and Hearst. The fact that Southerners had fought for the Union was not written in the textbooks that I read in school. What began as my intention to join the Sons of Confederate Veterans led me down a far different path than I had originally intended. Approximately 31,092 Tennesseans served in the federal armies, and 25 infantry regiments, 15 cavalry regiments, and 8 mounted infantry regiments were organized in the States. Among these was the 6th Tennessee Cavalry, which consisted primarily of men from West Tennessee, as well as southern Middle Tennessee counties along the Tennessee River. Because of its controversial actions during the war, it was branded by its enemies as an ignorant posse of men led by vicious and unprincipled leaders that were the scourge and terror of the lower eastern counties of West Tennessee and were as thoroughly detested and hated as any band of marauders who ever disgraced the name of soldiers. In the spring of 1861, the majority of Tennesseans were reluctant to secede from the Union. But President Lincoln's call for volunteers to suppress the rebellion following the bombardment of Fort Sumter proved to be the turning point. 2 months later, on June 8, 1861, Tennessee became the last state to secede to leave the Union and join the Southern Confederacy. But support for the Union had not disappeared completely within its borders. It is often assumed that pro-Union sentiment existed primarily in East Tennessee, but there was a significant number of like-minded men and women to the west, especially in the counties of Upper West Tennessee and those that straddled the Tennessee River in the southwest corner. Southern Unionists may have represented a minority of the electorate, but they were deemed as threats to the fledgling Confederacy. They were intimidated by their friends, neighbors, and family members, and they were branded as abolitionists, Tories, and black Republicans. They were threatened with arrest by local authorities and pressured into enlisting in the state's provisional army. As one unionist who had been forced to join noted, "I was not conscripted into the service, I was scared into it." Some fled with their families and went north across the Ohio River into southern Illinois and Indiana. In my research, I realized that the story of the 6th Tennessee Cavalry was intertwined with that of its organizer and leader, Colonel Fielding Hurst. Before the war ended, he would become the personification of Southern unionism in West Tennessee. Even today, no figure in that section's history is as despised or vilified as he. His reputation among the descendants of Confederate soldiers and civilians who lived in the region during the war was well deserved. The experiences of Fielding Hurst are an extreme example of what his fellow unionists endured before the fall of Forts Henry and Donelson in February 1862. To understand how he became so vindictive against his enemies, I believe it would help to know what he went through beforehand. Born in Claiborne County in Upper East Tennessee about 1810, Fielding Hurst married Milwaukee Huddleston in 1830, and 3 years later settled in McNairy County. Eventually, his parents and siblings joined him there. He became the county surveyor, a position that enabled he and his 5 brothers to acquire a large amount of acreage in northwest McNairy County and present-day Chester County that covered an estimated 21 square miles. During the war, this territory became known as the Hearst Nation, and it acquired a reputation for robbery and murder of unwanted visitors. The Hearsts and their related families were a close-knit clan, and no doubt by the force of his personality, Fielding was considered the family leader. When he made the decision to stand with the Union, all but one of his brothers followed suit. A younger brother, David Hearst, felt he should be compensated for the emancipation of the slaves and sided with the Confederacy instead. When the war began, Fielding Hurst was a prosperous lawyer, planter, and landowner with about 23 slaves, living in what was then the prosperous town of Purdy, the county seat of McNairy County. But it was well known among his friends and neighbors that he was an avid unionist. In the wake of the presidential election in the winter of 1860, he was among a group of 8 influential local citizens who felt Lincoln's election was not sufficient reason for secession. Ironically, for all the things that Hearst did and was blamed for throughout the war, his mansion was never burned to the ground. Today, it's the only 19th century structure still standing in what was once the vibrant town of Purdy. But the house is in a decrepit state and in bad need of restoration. It's supposedly haunted too, and the present owners have taken advantage of that reputation and made it a haunted house every October. As the fires of secession were stoked by Tennesseans such as Governor Isham G. Harris in the spring of 1861, Hearst's neighbors became paranoid of the influence he could potentially bring to the pro-union movement in the area. Between June 1861 and February 1862, he was arrested and imprisoned at least 3 times. In fall of 1861, as Governor Harris enacted a mandatory draft and confiscated weapons to supply additional troops for Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, Unionists in West Tennessee began to openly resist or flee with their families north. After making a public speech against secession, Hearst was arrested by order of the governor on November 27, 1861, and taken to Corinth, along with 4 or 5 other McNairy County Unionists. A captain with the 35th Mississippi Infantry recalled the scene as the prisoners were transported to Nashville for trial. As we marched them through the streets to the railroad station, we were surrounded by a dense crowd of excited, curious people, all anxious to get a sight of the infernal Lincolnites, as they called them. It was truly an awful sight to see men born upon Southern soil, compelled to be marched like felons through the streets of the town not 20 miles from their residence, charged with treason to their state and to their section. Hearst was imprisoned at the state penitentiary in Nashville for 37 days. Disloyal citizens were required to take an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. Hearst later recalled, "I think the oath of allegiance was administered to some of the prisoners, but Judge Humphrey said that he did not care if I had taken the oath of allegiance or not, for he knew I would not keep it if I did take it." According to one account, he was to be hanged on April 7, 1862, but a friend with ties to the Confederate government intervened and saved his life. When he returned home, Hearst found his farm had been ransacked by his secessionist neighbors. His livestock and horses had been stolen, and his family's food had been plundered. He was arrested once again in January 1862 and taken to Columbus, Kentucky, but his captors allowed him to return to McNairy County to gather proof of his innocence. At that time, he escaped and hid for a week in the swampy bottoms of the Tennessee River. There he was rescued by the federal gunboat USS Tyler that had proceeded up the river after the fall of Fort Donelson. Southern Unionists regarded the advancing federal soldiers as liberators, and many flocked to join their ranks. Hearst gathered together a group of loyalists and offered their services to the Union forces. In the spring of 1862, they were attached in an unofficial capacity to Major General Lew Wallace's command and served as guides, scouts, and spies in the vicinity of Pittsburgh Landing in eastern McNairy County. He and his men frustrated Confederate units in the area, harassing their pickets, cutting telegraph lines, and disabling railroad tracks in the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. One Confederate officer complained that he knew every hog path in the country and could evade capture. The invading forces utilized their knowledge of the local residents and terrain in this way until the siege of Corinth in May 1862. But Hearst wanted to do more than simply be a scout. He wanted to organize and lead his own cavalry regiment of Unionists for service in the Federal Army. Military Governor Andrew Johnson was more anxious to create regiments that would liberate his own home section of East Tennessee than ones from West Tennessee. Regardless, Hearst was persistent, traveled to Nashville to meet Johnson in person, and finally received his commission as Colonel of the 1st West Tennessee Cavalry on August 12, 1862. He would later be redesignated as the 6th Tennessee Cavalry. Back home, Hearst's friends were already assembling the first companies for the new regiment. 1 month later, 6 companies were organized, and they adopted a regimental motto: "I give my head and heart to God and our country, one language, one flag." Like their commanding officer, the men who enlisted had little or no prior military training. They had been farmers, lawyers, merchants, and school teachers before the war. They joined for a variety of reasons. The most common was genuine patriotism. Many wanted the Union to be preserved and not broken apart. Their grandfathers had fought for American independence almost 90 years earlier. Others simply could not turn their backs on their country. "I always adhered to the Union, and I still do," wrote William C. Hughes after the war. "I never was one of those men that thought more of my state than the whole government." Before he died, Sergeant James Wolverton of Company G purchased an American flag to be placed on his coffin. His son recalled, "He loved the flag so much that patriotism was almost a religion to him." The primary field of operations for Fielding Hearst and the 6th Tennessee Cavalry during the war was West Tennessee and North Mississippi. The regiment was initially assigned to a federal post at Bethel Station in McNairy County, not far from their homes. But incidents of horse stealing and waging private battles against their secessionist neighbors led to its transfer 30 miles away to Bolivar. Hearst described this section of southwest Tennessee as being in the midst of revelry, and his efforts to enlist new recruits were severely hampered. With the federal armies now in possession of the region, the Confederacy resorted to guerrilla warfare to hinder the Union war effort. They engaged in hit-and-run operations to disrupt communications and the flow of supplies, and they ambushed patrols and foraging parties. They kidnapped civilians and held them for ransom, cut telegraph lines, burnt bridges, and dismantled railroad tracks. Often it was Hearst and the 6th Tennessee that were sent into the countryside to deal with the guerrillas. But this only worsened the animosity the Confederates already held against them. And and presented both sides with opportunities to exact revenge for past wrongs. Adding to Hearst's frustration was the treatment he and his men received from the very government to which they had professed their loyalty. Despite his appeals to military Governor Johnson for assistance, the regiment was forced to use inadequate weapons and worn-out saddles and equipment during its first year of service. It was not until 10 months after their organization that they even received their first military payments. The men drilled, scouted, and picketed using their own personal weapons and horses while enduring what Hearst described as, quote, jeers and jibes from the Northern soldiers at the folly of working for nothing, and often suffered the comforts and luxuries enjoyed by their comrades. In July 1863, the 6th Tennessee joined the 2nd Iowa and 3rd Michigan Cavalry in pursuing Confederate forces outside of Jackson, Tennessee. Afterward, Federal stragglers discovered 30 barrels of whiskey and began terrorizing the town in a drunken stupor, breaking into homes and businesses and setting them on fire. One store in particular, a women's hat shop owned by a British citizen named Mrs. A.A. Newman, was especially vandalized. She complained to the federal military authorities at Memphis that soldiers from Hearst's command broke into her business, stole her merchandise, and took her bonnets to decorate the heads of their horses. Colonel Hearst denied the allegations and blamed the other 2 regiments for ransacking the town. But the military determined that Hearst's men were responsible, and Mrs. Newman was awarded $5,139.25 in damages that were deducted from the Tennessee's payroll. Hearst would not forget what he felt was an injustice committed against himself and his regiment. At this point in the war, the 6th Tennessee had become a target for Confederate forces in West Tennessee, and Hearst himself was a highly sought prize. While scouting near Summerville on July 25, 1863, he stopped alongside the road and talked with a widow and her daughter at the front gate of their home while waiting for his men to rejoin him. 2 Confederate soldiers on leave came upon Hearst and approached him from behind with guns drawn as the widow asked him, "Colonel, aren't you afraid the rebels will catch you?" They took Hearst's pistols from his saddle holsters and led him away, still on horseback, toward their encampment. Eventually, Hearst's men caught up with him, and he managed to escape his captors. When it comes to fielding Hearst, fact and fiction often intertwine. The best example is the legend of the mileposts. In July 1863, a detachment of the 6th Tennessee encountered 4 Confederate soldiers near Purdy, whom they suspected of being guerrillas. They were led by Captain John Ambrose Doc Wharton of Wilson's Tennessee Cavalry, a man whose intention to kill Hearst was well known. After a brief fight, the Confederates were captured and taken to Hearst. Wharton vowed that if you kill me, 10 of your men will go up for me, implying that they would be hanged for his murder. Regardless, Wharton and his men were shot and their bodies left on the road leading from Purdy to Pocahontas in McNairy County, or Carter County. The remains of at least one of these men, a 24-year-old from Alabama named Thomas W.S. Morgan, was eventually marked as a tombstone. The details of the encounter were related to Lieutenant Colonel D. M. Wisdom of Wilson's command in a letter to Colonel Philip E. Roddy, dated July 23, 1863. Yet over the years, truth has become embellished and hasn't gotten in the way of telling a good story. One historian with no documentation claimed that Hearst killed one every mile and buried them as mileposts. A more gruesome version claims the men were decapitated and their heads were placed on top of the posts. I even received an email a few years ago asking if it was true that Hearst had lined the heads up on his own front yard lawn. The services of the 6th Tennessee Cavalry and other Unionist regiments proved to be a double-edged sword for their northern superiors. The soldiers were more familiar with the countryside and knew which civilians could be trusted and which could not. But they were also prone to disappear for periods of time to engage in private operations against former friends and neighbors. Major General Stephen A. Hurlbut, commander of the 16th Army Corps at Memphis, grew frustrated with the undisciplined Southerners under his command. He acknowledged that Hearst was a thoroughly brave man, but he had no faculty of command or control over his men, and he believed that he should be removed from his leadership role. In January 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman had a new chief of cavalry for the military division of Mississippi. Brigadier General William Seward Smith was determined that his new command would be ready to fight Confederate cavalry leader Nathan Bedford Forrest. He granted Hurst more leeway than he had enjoyed at any point in the war, going so far as to inform Ulysses S. Grant that he had given Colonel Hurst a roving commission with his regiment and directed him to grub up West Tennessee. I think he will reduce that district to order. Hurst wasted little time realizing the full potential of his roving commission. In February 1864, his regiment disappeared once again from the eyes of its commanding officers at Memphis, and they showed up at Jackson, Tennessee. Hurst rode into town, gathered its most prominent residents together, and he made his intentions known. He demanded from them $5,139.25, the exact amount taken from his men as the result of Mrs. Newman's vandalism complaint 6 months earlier, or he burned the town. The ransom was paid 5 days later. Hurst and his men left Jackson, only to return 2 weeks later, cut the ropes for the town well, and set several buildings on fire. The town of Brownsville suffered a similar fate. Hurst's men reportedly showed no discretion between setting fire to the homes of Confederate sympathizers and their fellow Unionists. One of them wrote, "It appears that old Satan had been turned loose to go about injuring the innocent." In response to these acts of arson and several brutal murders of Confederate soldiers under his command, Forrest demanded that Field and Hurst be surrendered to Confederate authorities to be dealt with for the crimes he and his men had committed. When his demand was refused, he declared Hurst and the officers and men at his command outlaws and not entitled to be treated as prisoners of war falling into the hands of the Confederate States. In March 1864, Hurst and the 6th Tennessee were ordered from the outskirts of Memphis toward Jackson to hang upon and harass Forrest, impeding his movements as much as possible. But they were ordered not to bring him into a general engagement. With Forrest's outlaw declaration in mind, Hurst was advised by his superiors to take no wagon train that would slow him down or allow himself to be surprised or drawn into a trap. For whatever reason, Hurst chose to defy his orders, taking with him 2 ambulances and 5 wagons with 50,000 rounds of ammunition. Letters from soldiers in the regiment reveal that he chose to attack elements of Forrest's cavalry, which consisted of the 12th, 14th, and 15th Tennessee, near Bolivar, Tennessee, despite reports from his scouts that they were outnumbered. What promised to be a battle on the morning of March 29th instead turned into a 15-mile chase, with the 6th Tennessee abandoning its wagon train and falling back to the safety of Memphis. Confederate Brigadier General James R. Chalmers boasted of the chase. Colonel Neely of the 13th Tennessee met the traitor Hurst at Bolivar, and after a short conflict, drove Hurst hatless into Memphis, leaving in our hands all of his wagons, papers, and his mistresses, both black and white. The humiliating defeat proved to be the final act for the 6th Tennessee Cavalry. Colonel Hurst was placed under a general court-martial for his conduct, although no official action apparently was taken against him. His extortion of funds from the citizens of Jackson, Tennessee came to light a few months later, and it was learned that the ransom that had been taken to compensate his men for the amount deducted from their payroll had instead been deposited with the Memphis dry goods business for his own private benefit. Hurst remained in command, but his men had their horses taken from them and reassigned to other Federal cavalry regiments. He became frustrated with his northern superiors and requested that his men be transferred from Memphis to Nashville. We are placed here exclusively under Yankee officers who have no sympathy for a loyal Tennessean, he wrote. I would most respectfully and earnestly ask to be removed to the Department of the Cumberland, where I will be under the control, if not of a Tennessean, but at least men who believe that there is some patriotism south of the Ohio River. Aside from marginal participation in the Battle of Nashville in December 1864, the 6th Tennessee saw little meaningful action the remainder of the war. At one point, Hearst recounted his experiences and frustrations. From the beginning of the organization of this regiment, impediments and barriers of every conceivable shape have been thrown in our way by those who ought to have been our friends. No favors have been shown us, and no encouragement whatever has been extended toward us. All the success we have had being attributable alone to the genuine patriotism and self-sacrifice of the officers and men who composed the regiment. Fielding Hearst resigned his commission effective January 8, 1865, citing poor health. Lieutenant Colonel William J. Smith assumed command and was eventually promoted to Brevet Brigadier General. The regiment fought guerrillas in south central Middle Tennessee and North Alabama and guarded government cattle until their discharge from military service in Pulaski, Tennessee on July 26, 1865. Officers of the 6th Tennessee were elected or appointed to various public offices during Reconstruction. Hearst was elected a state senator representing Hardeman, McNairy, and Hartford counties, but resigned a few months later to become judge for the 12th Judicial Circuit, serving from 1865 to 1869. He was appointed the collector of internal revenue, but was forced to step down amid allegations of misappropriated funds. He lost his fortune as a result, and he had to sell his mansion in Purdy and settle in the Hearst Nation. There he died on April 3, 1882, at about the age of 72. I believe the most objective statement about conditions in West Tennessee in 1864 were made by Forrest biographer and Confederate veteran John Allen White, who wrote, "It is difficult for those who did not live through this unhappy period and in this immediate section to appreciate the bitterness of feeling which then prevailed. 3 years of civil war had passed, not without a deplorable effect upon the morals of the rank and file of either army. War does not bring out the noblest traits in the majority of those who from choice or necessity follow its bloodstained paths. Too often the better qualities hide away, and those that are harsh and cruel prevail." Fielding Hearst was truly a man of contradictions. He was both a patriot and a terrorist, a man who bravely stood on his principles for the Union in the face of opposition from friends and neighbors, but committed or condoned acts and vengeance against them outside the realm of his military responsibilities. The abuses committed against him and the men under his command undoubtedly played a role in their acts of retribution against both soldiers and civilians throughout the war. One of the disappointing aspects of my research was the lack of personal letters, diaries, and memoirs written by Fielding Hearst and the soldiers of the 6th Tennessee. This leaves a void in the historical record of the regiment, and we are unable to learn more about their personal principles and their individual reasons for supporting the Union. Perhaps these materials could still be found and enable us to gain a better understanding of this controversial regiment. Recently, I discovered this small piece in the Bolivar Bulletin, dated November 29, 1877, showing that reconciliation was indeed possible even among the most bitter of enemies. It reads, "Reconstruction received a striking illustration in the late visit of Colonel F. Hearst to Bolivar. He it was who pillaged and plundered our people during the war, and sent terror into our homes by the lawlessness of his bold banditti. And now to see him handshaking with our citizens is evidence sufficient that we have forgiven, if not forgotten, the doings of a once relentless persecutor. This display of magnanimity on the part of the Southern people is proof of the well-adjusted civilization and pacific disposition of our section. The Civil War did not often bring out the noblest traits from either Union or Confederate in Southwest Tennessee and North Mississippi. The scars of this terrible time were carried for generations, and the hatred felt towards Fielding Hearst and the 6th Tennessee Cavalry endures even today. It was my purpose to present a fair and accurate account of the regiment and its controversial leader. Regardless of its reputation, I believe there were good men who served in its ranks, who wanted nothing more than the preservation of the Union. And it is to these men whose service for their country I hope I have honored